So usually when we talk about like a bridge collapsing,
Right.
there's this, this baseline expectation of structural accountability. Like you look at the blueprints, you examine the steel girders, you review all the concrete stress tests.
Right, exactly. The hard data.
Exactly. And eventually the structural engineer just points at some microscopic fracture in a support beam and says, there, that's the flaw. That is why it fell.
It's measurable.
Right. It's completely measurable. It's binary. It either holds the weight or it doesn't.
And it is entirely unforgiving.
Mm.
I mean, bad materials or a bad design, they just naturally lead to a catastrophic physical failure.
Yeah.
In the realm of engineering, we like things to be objectively visible.
Yeah, we have to.
Right. We demand that they be governed by strict, unbreakable laws because the consequences of ignoring those laws are, well, they're immediate and they're fatal.
Right. But then, and this is what's so wild to me, you step into the world of how human beings approach their own societal structures. You know, how we approach religion, philosophy, macropolitics, and suddenly that whole engineering blueprint is just thrown completely out the window.
Thrown right out. Yeah.
We replace all that structural integrity with like wishful thinking. We assume that just because we feel a certain way or because we perform a really specific historical ritual, the bridge of our civilization will somehow magically hold itself up.
It's the absolute definition of a systemic delusion.
Yeah.
And honestly, it is exactly the delusion that the source material we are examining today sets out to just completely destroy.
Destroy is a strong word, but yeah.
Yeah, it's accurate, though. So today on the Deep Dive, we are looking at Lecture 5 from the Tolu Islam audio archives. And the central thesis here is, it's a brutal system-level reality check. The author completely dismantles the superstitious, ritualistic approach to religion and replaces it with a framework based on, basically, biological physics, thermodynamics, and objective reality.
I want to push back right away, though, because are we saying that every philosophical or, religious framework that isn't rooted in hard physics is just a delusion? Because humanity has relied on unprovable sentimental belief systems for thousands of years, right? To build communities, to find comfort.
Sure, they have. But the author of this lecture would argue that relying on those unprovable superstitious frameworks is precisely why so many of those communities eventually fracture, stagnate, and collapse.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. The mission of this text is to establish what the author calls the uniformity of law. This is like the core premise we need to grasp before we look at literally anything else today.
Okay, so unpack that for me. The uniformity of law. It sounds, I don't know, like something out of a super dry jurisprudence textbook, but you're linking it directly to physics.
Right. I know it sounds dry, but it's actually fascinating. It means the universe operates on strict, unyielding physical parameters. And there are absolutely no magical exceptions to these parameters.
None at all.
None. Water boils at a specific temperature at a specific atmospheric pressure. Gravity accelerates mass at a constant rate. Always. And the text argues that the ethical and social laws required to sustain a human civilization, they must be viewed as being just as objective and unyielding as the laws of thermodynamics.
So wait, if a society ignores the physical laws of the universe, no amount of sentimental praying or historical ritual is going to save them from a collapse.
Precisely. Biology and thermodynamics simply do not care about your feelings.
Right.
They don't care about your history or your perceived moral purity. If you do not plant a crop according to the actual laws of botany and atmospheric science, you will starve.
Even if you pray really hard over the dirt.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how loudly you chant a prayer over barren dirt. The uniformity of law demands empirical competence. Period.
Okay, but wait, isn't the whole point of, ethical or religious frameworks to provide human comfort precisely because the physical universe is so brutal and unforgiving?
That's the common view, yeah.
Right. Are we just supposed to become these cold, calculating scientists and just abandon the basic human need for psychological solace?
Oh, and that tension is exactly where the author begins the critique. Because the text argues that the pursuit of mere psychological comfort has been weaponized.
Weaponized.
It has become a trap that keeps entire populations completely paralyzed. And the lecture centers this argument around the linguistic redefinition of one specific word, which is sawab.
Okay, sawab, which is traditionally translated as what, just reward?
Simply as reward, yeah. Usually in a religious context,
Yeah.
like points you get for doing something good.
Right, reward points. So the lecture kicks off with this incredibly sharp, almost humorous attack on how people traditionally interact with scripture just to get this sawab. The author points out that people read these foundational texts basically for the sake of accumulating mindless, magical reward points.
Yeah, the invisible cosmic scoreboard.
Exactly. And there is this specific Punjabi anecdote in the text that highlights this perfectly.
Oh, I love this part. Yes, the author uses this very localized cultural behavior to expose a massive systemic flaw. He points out that if you go up to someone and ask them what the word sawab actually means, like structurally, what does it mean? Whether you ask them in Arabic, in Urdu, or in Punjabi, nobody can actually define the mechanism of it.
Right. They have no idea.
They do not know what it is. They just know they desperately want it.
Yeah.
Can basically say, I don't know what it means, but I know I need to acquire it to be safe in the afterlife.
It is the ultimate blind consumerism. It's like, I don't know what the product does, just put it in my cart.
Yes.
It is basically like, okay, think about when you get a massive software update on your phone.
All the terms and conditions.
Yes, memorizing the terms and conditions of a software update without understanding a single line of the code or what it actually does to your phone's operating system just because you think clicking agree gives you good luck.
That is an excellent modern parallel. Honestly, it's spot on. But the author argues the implications here are far, far more sinister than just a harmless cultural quirk or, a psychological coping mechanism.
Wait, sinister.
Yeah. This obsession with undefined and magical reward points is framed in the lecture as a literal systemic conspiracy.
A conspiracy, that is a really heavy word to use. How does seeking comfort and spiritual reward translate into a conspiracy?
Okay, think about it from the perspective of a ruling elite, or a corrupt political class, or an entrenched clergy.
Okay.
If you have a foundational text that contains actual revolutionary socio-political laws demanding economic equity, empirical observation of the universe, strict justice that applies equally to the ruler and the ruled, that text is incredibly dangerous to the status quo.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I see where you're going. Because if the masses actually read it as a manual for building a society,
Right.
they will use it to dismantle the corrupt elite.
Exactly. So if you're the elite, how do you neutralize that threat without openly banning the book? Because banning it would cause an immediate revolt.
Right. You can't just burn the book.
No. So you convince the masses that the text isn't a manual for operating a just society at all. You convince them that it is a magical incantation.
Wow.
You tell them that just reciting the syllables, completely without any comprehension of the underlying laws, earns them invisible points for an afterlife.
That is incredibly dark. So nobody actually reads it to change the real world. They just read it to rack up points.
Yeah.
And the text even mentions, I remember this part, how people use it to send points to dead people.
Yes. The lecture is absolutely scathing about that specific practice. It explicitly states that these sociological laws are meant for the living. They are for human guidance in the physical world.
Right.
They are not some mechanism to magically transfer ethereal currency to a deceased relative. By keeping the masses focused on this undefined sawab, the elite successfully obscure the actual laws.
They hide the blueprint in plain sight.
Exactly. The book gets put on a high shelf. It gets wrapped in a beautiful silk cloth. It is treated with the utmost physical reverence.
And completely neutralized as an engine for socio-political change.
You nailed it. Completely neutralized.
That reframing is brutal. It takes what most people consider a highly pious act, reading a text purely for comfort and reward, and exposes it as a form of engineered political apathy. It really makes me think about how this applies beyond just religious texts, too. Think about modern corporate culture.
Oh, interesting. How do you mean?
The corporate equivalent of Sawab. Think about the massive compliance training modules or those diversity and inclusion seminars that employees have to click through every single year.
Oh, right. The ones everyone just skips through.
Exactly. Nobody is actually engaging with the ethical principles of a healthy workplace. They are just clicking next as fast as humanly possible to get the PDF certificate at the end.
Right. Just to show HR they did it.
Yeah. They are chasing the corporate sawab just to stay out of trouble while the actual structural toxicity of the company remains completely unchanged.
That is a perfect execution of the author's underlying premise. When a population, whether it's a religious community or a corporate workforce, when they seek the badge of compliance rather than the hard work of systemic implementation, the status quo is protected.
Because no one is actually doing the work.
Right. The source text demands active, critical engagement with reality. It is a complete rejection of tacit, ritualistic consumption.
So, okay, if this text completely rejects the idea of reading for invisible points, then what is the actual mechanism for engaging with these ideas? If I'm not supposed to be chanting the words for a reward, what am I actually supposed to be doing with them?
Right, so that requires us to fundamentally redefine how the text uses the word for signs. The word is ayat. And to understand that, we have to look at how the author pivots from the linguistic text straight to the physical universe.
Okay, because ayat is traditionally translated just as verses of the Quran, right? Like literal sentences in a book.
Traditionally, yes. But the author says we need to look much, much wider. The physical universe itself, the Big Bang, which the text refers to as the initial smoke or gaseous vapor,
Uh-huh.
the precise orbital mechanics of the sun and the moon, the thermodynamic water cycle, the predictable alteration of day and night. These are not just poetic background noise designed to make us feel small.
They aren't just metaphors.
No. The text argues these phenomena are literal, objective ayat. They are signs. And they are pointing directly to a singular lawgiver who established that uniformity of law we talked about.
Let me make sure I follow this. The author is saying that studying the evaporation cycle of a cloud is fundamentally the same activity as studying a verse in the scripture.
They are two sides of the exact same coin. The physical phenomena of the universe are signs pointing to the Creator's physical laws, just as the linguistic verses point to the Creator's social laws. But, and this is a huge but, the text is very careful to define the utility of a sign. A sign is not the ultimate destination itself.
The lecture uses an analogy for this, doesn't it? The desert and the bird.
Yes. The author argues that if you are wandering in a barren desert and you see a bird flying overhead, that bird is a sign. It was an ayat indicating that there's a body of water nearby.
Right. Or like if you see smoke rising in the distance, it's a sign that there's a fire.
Exactly.
But if you just stand there staring at the bird, praising how beautiful the bird is, or sitting down and writing poetry about the smoke, you are going to die of thirst in the desert.
You will literally die.
You have to follow the sign to the water.
Precisely. You cannot just look at the sign and stop there, treating the sign itself as an object of worship. Nor can you ignore the sign and blindly hope you just, stumble upon the water by accident. You must observe the empirical data, understand its mechanism, and take physical action based on that reality.
Which brings us to what might be, I think, the most devastating critique in the entire lecture. Because if we accept that the universe is full of physical signs demanding empirical observation and action, we have to talk about how the author redefines zikr.
Remembrance of God.
Yes, remembrance. And to do this, the text completely roasts the traditional concept of the hermit.
The ascetic mystic.
Yeah. Historically, the hermit is often held up as like the ultimate image of piety, right? The person who has conquered their worldly desire.
Someone who has transcended the material world.
Exactly. But the author paints an incredibly vivid, almost grotesque picture of this figure to show how utterly useless they actually are. The text describes a man who has retreated entirely from society. He goes deep into the forest and stands on one leg for 40 years.
A literal physical withdrawal from human responsibility and the empirical world.
And the physical description in the lecture is, it's brutal. It is not romanticized at all. The man stands there for 40 years. His hair grows all the way down to his feet, tangling into the dirt.
Yep.
He cries in his isolation until the flesh on his cheeks literally rots away from the tears. He stands so still for so long that birds are actively building nests on his head.
The imagery is shocking on purpose.
Wait, literal birds?
Literal birds nesting in his hair. The author is asking a very cold structural question here. What utility does this suffering actually have?
Exactly. The text asks, what is this guy actually doing? He is producing absolutely nothing of value for the survival, the justice, or the betterment of humanity. He's just suffering uselessly in a vacuum.
Right.
It is narcissism disguised as spirituality. And the author contrasts this starkly with the true definition of zikr found in the text.
Because true remembrance, the author argues, is not isolating yourself in a dark cave. True zikr is studying the creation of the heavens and the earth.
It's science.
It is astrophysics. It is cosmology. It is cellular biology. The text points out that true believers, those actually engaged in zikr, are explicitly described in the scripture as people who reflect deeply on the physical creation of the universe.
So the woman in the laboratory looking through an electron microscope at cellular metabolism, or the engineer calculating the tensile strength of our metaphorical bridge from earlier, they are the ones actually engaged in zikr.
According to this framework, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because they are interacting with the lawgiver through the objective laws he embedded in the physical universe. The hermit produces no value. The text demands actions that have utility, actions that benefit humanity and possess permanence. You simply cannot build a just society with a man standing on one leg in a forest.
I am trying to think of the modern equivalent of this hermit because, we don't really have people standing in forests on one leg anymore.
Mostly.
But we do have people who completely detach from the physical work of building society while claiming moral superiority.
I would argue the modern equivalent is the hyper-engaged, purely theoretical keyboard warrior.
Oh, wow.
The person who spends like 14 hours a day isolated in their room, debating the micro nuances of abstract political philosophy or social justice on the internet, completely convinced of their own absolute righteousness.
Oh, that is spot on. They are crying over the state of the world. Their digital hair is growing to the floor, but they aren't organizing a community food bank.
No.
They aren't running for a local office. They aren't physically engineering a solution to dirty water. They have retreated into a purely abstract digital asceticism.
Producing zero physical utility for humanity.
Zero. And that danger of retreating into pure abstraction is exactly why the text brings up the historical warning of Imam Ghazali.
Yes.
And I was really hoping we would get to Ghazali, because this is where I really have to challenge the text. Imam Ghazali is widely considered one of the most brilliant foundational minds in history. His theological and philosophical works are studied globally. Are we really just dismissing a lifetime of genius intellectual output because he engaged in mystical thought?
Well, the text is not dismissing his intellectual capacity at all. It is highlighting the ultimate tragedy of how he applied it.
Okay, explain that.
The author uses Ghazali as the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when you divorce intellect from empirical reality. So Ghazali spent the first half of his life engaged in pure abstract intellectual philosophy. He wrote massive, incredibly complex volumes of thought, debating causality and the literal nature of existence.
But then he had like a massive epistemological crisis, right?
Yeah.
He basically broke down.
He did. He realized that pure intellect, unanchored from physical reality, could be used to doubt absolutely anything. If you are only using abstract logic, you can eventually debate yourself into a corner where you aren't even sure if you exist.
Wow.
So he abandoned his academic post, became a mystic, and spent the second half of his life trying to refute the very philosophical framework he had built during the first half.
Wait, he literally debated himself into a circle.
He did. And this raises an incredibly important question about how we structure our search for truth. The author is arguing that intellect alone, when divorced from the objective, empirical laws of the physical universe, leads to endless, useless circles of doubt. You cannot build a stable, enduring civilization on pure, detached theory or subjective mysticism. You need physical reality as your anchor to prove whether a theory actually works.
It brings us right back to the bridge.
Exactly.
You can sit in a room and use pure abstract mathematics to design a bridge that looks totally perfect on a chalkboard. But if you refuse to actually go outside and test the physical tensile strength of the steel against gravity, your math means nothing.
Gravity doesn't care about your math.
Eventually, gravity is going to win. The bridge will fall. The physical universe is the anchor that stops the intellect from spinning off into a delusion.
Exactly. And this realization that physical, empirical reality must be the anchor for truth sets up a massive conflict with those who claim authority based purely on tradition or feeling. Which leads us directly to the text analysis of the clash between empirical reality and the traditional clergy.
The tragicomedy of the clergy?
Yes.
The lecture tackles this by forcefully redefining another foundational word, right? Ilm, which translates to knowledge.
And the author is brutally strict about this definition. He references Surah 17, verse 36, which explicitly states that a person should not pursue that of which they have no knowledge, because the hearing, the sight, and the mind will all be held accountable.
The hearing and the sight, so the physical senses.
Precisely. The text argues that true ilm must be rooted in the physical senses. It is empirical data. It is measurable reality. It is not a blind assumption. It is not some inherited dogma from your ancestors. And it is certainly not a warm feeling in your heart.
Right.
If it cannot be empirically verified or logically deduced from physical reality, it does not meet the standard of ilm.
This completely upends how religious knowledge is usually framed, though. Usually faith is praised precisely because it lacks empirical evidence. Believing without seeing is considered the highest virtue. But this text is saying the exact opposite. It's saying that claiming knowledge without empirical observation is actually a structural failure.
It is a massive systemic liability. And the text provides two brilliant historical anecdotes to demonstrate exactly what happens when a society elevates people who lack this empirical physical knowledge to positions of power.
Oh, the loudspeaker fatwa.
Yes.
I love how the author uses such a specific, relatively modern example to prove this massive historical point. So the author takes us back to the early days when loudspeakers were first introduced in places like Delhi and Karachi.
At the time, this was a highly disruptive, seemingly magical new technology.
Right. Suddenly, a single human voice can just boom across an entire neighborhood. And what happens? The Grand Muftis, the absolute highest religious authorities in the region, issue fatwas binding religious rulings, declaring loudspeakers to be haram, completely forbidden to use, especially in a religious context.
And why exactly did they issue that ruling?
Because they did not understand the physics of sound waves.
Right.
They were operating entirely outside of empirical reality. They didn't know how a microphone converted acoustic energy into electrical energy, amplified it, and converted it back into acoustic energy. To them, it wasn't physics. It was just strange, new, and therefore it must be a corruption of the sacred space.
They reacted to their own ignorance with theological panic.
Exactly. But, and I want to play devil's advocate for just a second here, I can understand the hesitance around new technology. Like, if a loud, crackling mechanical device suddenly alters the traditional quiet atmosphere of a sacred space, isn't a conservative reaction somewhat natural? Why is this framed as a fundamental failure of knowledge?
Because their reaction wasn't based on a structural understanding of the object they were banning. It was based on ignorance disguised as theological authority.
Ah, disguised authority.
Right. If they had empirical ilm, they would have looked at it and said, this is merely a tool that amplifies sound waves. It has no moral alignment of its own. It is completely neutral. But because they lacked the physics, they assigned a moral panic to a machine. And the punchline of the author's anecdote proves how reactionary and hollow their authority really was.
Oh, it's so good. Because years later, after society has moved on and the technology becomes ubiquitous, what do you see? You see 4 loudspeakers strapped to the minaret of every single mosque that previously banned them.
It perfectly illustrates the reactive, ultimately powerless nature of a worldview divorced from physical science. They fight objective reality, reality inevitably wins, and then they quietly adopt the very reality they previously condemned, pretending they never opposed it.
That's embarrassing.
It is. It shows that when you lack empirical knowledge, you are always at the mercy of those who possess it.
And the text doesn't stop with the loudspeaker. There is a second anecdote that is even more pointed. The meteorologist versus the mullah.
This anecdote is incredibly revealing about how human beings use specialized language and jargon to create the illusion of competence.
Yes. So the author describes a scenario in an agricultural society where farmers are desperately asking about the coming rain. Their entire livelihood depends on the climate.
Right, if it doesn't rain, they starve.
Exactly. And the local cleric will step up and use these incredibly heavy, fancy Arabic terminologies, saying things like Qadarat al-Amtar, instead of just saying drops of rain, trying to sound incredibly holy, profound, and connected to the divine will.
He uses the aesthetic of knowledge to mask a profound ignorance.
Right, because despite the beautiful vocabulary, this cleric knows absolutely nothing about actual agricultural science. He knows nothing about atmospheric pressure, humidity, or global weather patterns.
Meanwhile, a simple meteorologist who might not know a single word of ancient Arabic terminology, who might just be looking at a barometer in a simple lab coat, actually understands the evaporation cycle.
Yeah.
They understand the barometric pressure and the objective mechanisms of the universe that produce the rain.
So the text is forcing us to ask, who has the actual knowledge here? Who possesses the true ilm? It is the meteorologist. Meteorologists can actually tell the farmer when to plant the seed. The cleric can only offer a fancy word and a wish.
And this raises a deeply systemic danger, which is the author's main macro-political point here.
What's that?
When a society allows individuals who are completely ignorant of biological physics, thermodynamics, and empirical reality to dictate social laws and societal direction, that society becomes fundamentally unstable.
Because their leadership is entirely disconnected from the real world.
Yes.
I see this all the time in modern corporate structures, too. How often do we see executives using massive amounts of complex corporate jargon like synergistic paradigms or agile optimization to completely mask the fact that they have no foundational empirical competence in how their own product is actually built?
It is the exact same psychological mechanism. The jargon creates an illusion of authority, protecting the speaker from being challenged by the people actually doing the empirical work. The text laments that these historical religious figures spent their time debating abstract, unprovable things.
Like what?
They would argue endlessly over the micro-minutiae of washing rituals, or debate whether certain historical prophets were made of physical flesh or literal ethereal light.
Which is an utterly useless debate because you cannot empirically prove either side.
Exactly. They fill entire massive libraries with volumes on these abstract topics, all while ignoring the physical world entirely. They abandoned the study of the universe to others, and as a result, they lost their agency in the real world.
They are essentially standing on our metaphorical bridge, arguing violently over what color to paint the handrails, while the main steel support beams underneath them are literally rusting away into nothing.
That's exactly it.
It is structural negligence on a civilizational scale. And the text solution to this absolute failure of leadership is to completely flip the hierarchy of who we consider to be an intellectual authority.
This is perhaps one of the most surprising, radical, and structurally disruptive textual interpretations the author presents in the entire lecture. It centers around the word ulema.
The scholars, the learned ones. I mean, if you hear someone today say, the ulema have issued a decree, you immediately picture a council of men with long beards sitting in a seminary, surrounded by ancient, dusty books of historical jurisprudence.
Right.
The word is almost universally used to refer exclusively to religious clerics and theologians.
It is completely monopolized by the clergy. But the author says, let's look at how the actual text of the Quran uses that specific word. Let's look at the context of Surah 35, known as Surah Fatir. The author walks us through the verses immediately leading up to the mention of the ulema.
And what are those verses talking about? Are they talking about washing rituals or how to pray?
Not at all. The text describes the rain falling from the sky. It describes the diverse colors and biological variations of crops and fruits. It details the complex geology of the earth, specifically mentioning mountains with streaks of white, red, and deep raven black.
Wait, so the text explicitly mentions red and black mountains?
Yes. It categorizes the biodiversity of animals and livestock. It is literally describing botany, meteorology, biology, and geology.
It is describing the physical sciences.
Yes. And what is so revolutionary here is that immediately after detailing these physical scientific phenomena, the varying mineral colors of the rocks, the cellular diversity of the plants, the source text says, "Of his servants, only those who have knowledge, the ulema, stand in true awe of him."
Let's really break down the implication of this, because it completely shatters the traditional power structure. The author is saying that the scripture explicitly links the prestigious title of ulema, the true scholars, not to the people debating theology in a dark room, but to the people out in the field studying the mountains, the crops, and the animals.
The text is structurally stripping the title of scholar away from the traditional religious clergy and handing it directly to the geologists, the biologists, the meteorologists, and the astrophysicists.
That is massive.
It is. It redefines scholarship from the memorization of history to the empirical observation of physical reality.
But why geology? Like, why does the text explicitly link looking at the different colors of mountains to experiencing true awe of the creator? Doesn't a cleric feel awe when they read a beautiful piece of scripture?
The author points out the tragic irony of the modern traditionalist here. A cleric might spend their entire life reading ancient texts about jurisprudence. But if that cleric walks outside and looks at a black mountain and a white mountain, all they see are two big rocks.
Because they lack the empirical ilm to see anything else.
Exactly. They do not understand the chemical composition. They do not know that the red mountain is the result of massive iron oxidation over millions of years.
Right.
They do not know the black mountain is basalt formed by unimaginable thermodynamic heat and volcanic pressure, while the white is chalk or limestone formed by the crushed shells of ancient marine life. Because they do not understand the terrifying scale of time, pressure, and biological physics that created that difference, they cannot experience the profound structural awe that the true ulema, the scientist, experiences.
The scientist's awe is rooted in measurable reality, while the cleric's awe is rooted in abstract sentiment.
Precisely.
When the geologist sees the staggering complexity and the perfect uniformity of law in the tectonic plates, they are struck with a terror and an awe that the cleric simply cannot access, because the cleric is blind to the actual ayat, the actual physical signs.
The cleric is too busy looking for the magical solid points to notice the thermodynamic miracles happening right in front of them. It is a complete inversion of how society normally thinks about religious scholarship.
Yeah, it's a total flip.
The author is essentially saying, you want to be a true religious scholar. Go get a PhD in geology. Go study the atmospheric water cycle. Put down the book of centuries-old opinions and look at the physical universe.
I have to ask, though, does this mean the text is arguing that religion is just science? Like, if the true scholars are scientists, are we just replacing theology with a physics textbook?
Yeah.
Does morality still exist in this framework?
That's a great question. The text is not saying religion is only science. It is saying that true religion, true ethical permanence, requires science as its absolute baseline.
Okay.
Morality without an understanding of physical reality is impotent. You cannot execute justice if you do not understand how the world works. Which brings us to the final and arguably most crucial concept in the entire lecture, Tazkir-i Kainat.
Tazkir-i Kainat, the conquering of the universe, the harnessing of physical forces. This is where the lecture pivots from linguistic redefinition to like a brutal macro-historical societal stress test.
The author argues that the natural forces of the universe, the immense gravity of the sun, the orbit of the moon, the kinetic energy of the winds, the staggering power of the atom, these are not sacred, mysterious objects meant to be worshipped from afar.
Right, they aren't gods.
No, they are tools. They are physical mechanisms that humanity has been explicitly given the capacity and the mandate to harness.
The lecture explicitly mentions using the orbits of the sun and moon to create a functional calendar. You don't bow down to the sun. You calculate its precise mathematical trajectory so you can track time, predict the seasons for agriculture, and navigate ships across the oceans. You conquer it.
Exactly. But to explain why this is so critical, the author lays out a macro-historical analysis of the modern world that is incredibly stark and, quite honestly, very uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, this part was intense.
He divides the global approach to these physical laws into two distinct failed camps, and then presents a third, synthetic ideal.
Okay, let's look at the two failed camps first. How does the author analyze the trajectory of the West?
The author observes that Western civilization has successfully embraced the first half of the equation. They have engaged in Tazkir-i Kainat.
They harnessed the tools.
They did. They fiercely studied the empirical sciences. They mastered thermodynamics to build engines. They conquered aerodynamics to achieve flight. They mapped the human genome. And they literally split the atom. They have successfully harnessed the physical laws of nature to an unprecedented degree.
They did the empirical work. They didn't stand on one leg in a forest. They built laboratories. But the author categorizes them as a failure. Why?
Because, the text argues, they operate largely based on national self-interest, economic exploitation, and constantly shifting human philosophies rather than permanent universal ethical laws.
So they mastered the physics, but they abandoned the ethics. And what is the result of that imbalance? Like, what happens when a society achieves absolute scientific mastery but lacks a permanent ethical anchor?
The atomic bomb, global imperialism, the capacity for industrialized mass destruction. When you master the physical laws of the universe but discard the unyielding ethical laws of universal justice and human equity, science just becomes an immensely powerful weapon of mass destruction. It serves the elite rather than serving humanity.
Okay, so that is the failure of the West, mastery of physics, but a catastrophic failure of universal ethics. What about the East, or what we might call traditionalist societies? How does the author critique them?
The author argues they represent the exact opposite failure, which is equally disastrous.
How so?
The traditionalists loudly claim to hold the book of permanent ethical values. They claim to have the moral high ground, preaching about justice, peace, and spiritual purity. But as we've discussed throughout this deep dive, they have completely abandoned the physical sciences.
They retreated into mysticism. They spent their time debating ancient jurisprudence and seeking sawab points while ignoring the objective reality of the physical universe entirely.
Precisely. They let the loudspeakers and the airplanes and the antibiotics and the modern agricultural techniques be invented by someone else.
Right.
And what is the historical result of claiming massive ethical superiority while remaining completely ignorant of physical laws?
Poverty, weakness, total structural collapse.
And colonization. They were dominated and colonized by the societies that did master the physical laws. The text is utterly brutal in its assessment here. Biology and thermodynamics do not care about your claimed moral purity.
They don't care at all.
If you cannot harness the water cycle to feed your people, and if you cannot master physics to defend your borders against technologically advanced societies, your beautiful ethical book is completely useless.
It's like having the perfect blueprint for a utopian society, but refusing to pick up a hammer to actually build it, and then being shocked when a foreign army with advanced weaponry just bulldozes your land. Your ethics couldn't save you because you lacked the physics to enforce them.
That is the exact tragedy the author is highlighting. We have science weaponized by self-interest on one side, and we have ethics rendered completely powerless by scientific ignorance on the other. Both are structural failures that will eventually lead to civilizational collapse.
I have to admit, this is an incredibly heavy realization. If science without ethics is a bomb, and ethics without science is a surrender, how do we practically synthesize them? What is the actual solution the text offers to this massive global imbalance?
The solution is the synthesis of both forces, and the author defines this synthesis by redefining one final critical term, the momin, the true believer.
Let me guess. Just like Ayat, Zikr, and Ulema, the author completely strips the traditional passive meaning away from this word too.
Entirely. A true believer, a momin, according to this framework, is not just a pious individual who sits in the corner of a mosque and prays softly. A momin is a societal architect who actively conquers the physical forces of nature.
They do the science.
They are the ones mastering the sciences, building the engineering marvels, and harnessing the kinetic energy of the universe.
But they don't stop there.
No. Crucially, they strictly and uncompromisingly apply that immense physical power according to permanent divine ethical values. They use the mastery of physics not to colonize or exploit, but to ensure peace, justice, economic equity, and biological survival for all of humanity.
So without science, ethics are powerless. Without ethics, science is a weapon. The momin is the one who fuses them together into a stable structure. The text even points out the linguistic root of momin, doesn't it?
Yes. The root of the word momin comes from am, which literally translates to peace and security. The author argues that you cannot possibly provide global peace and security if you do not have the technological, agricultural, and physical capability to enforce it and sustain it against those who would seek to destroy it.
Wow.
Peace requires power, and power requires the mastery of physics.
This is the ultimate societal stress test. It is demanding that a society masters both the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of universal human equity simultaneously. If you fail at either one of those, your civilization will eventually shatter. The physical universe demands empirical competence, and the social universe demands absolute justice.
It is an incredibly demanding worldview. It completely strips away any excuse for laziness, any excuse for retreating from the world into a comfortable hermit's cave, and any excuse for hiding behind religious jargon.
No hiding allowed.
It says you have to be in the laboratory, you have to be in the agricultural fields, you have to be studying the geological fault lines, and you have to be applying all of that hard-won knowledge ethically.
It is the ultimate rejection of passive existence. I mean, let's take a breath and recap this immense journey for you, the listener, because we've covered a massive amount of philosophical and scientific ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the absurdity of the sawab trap, this systemic delusion that reading a text is just about chanting for invisible magical reward points. We saw how that mechanism is literally designed by entrenched powers to keep people passive and comfortable rather than engaged in building a just society.
Right. And then we explored how the text redefines the very nature of signs and remembrance. It moved us aggressively away from the useless, narcissistic suffering of the ascetic hermit standing in the woods.
With the birds on his head.
With the birds, yeah. And pointed us toward the active empirical study of the physical universe. The Big Bang, the orbital mechanics, the thermodynamic water cycle. These are the true signs demanding our attention.
From there, we watched the text absolutely roast the traditional clergy for their arrogant ignorance of basic physical laws. Through the loudspeaker fatwa and the story of the meteorologist versus the mullah, we saw the catastrophic danger of letting people who do not understand objective reality dictate how a society runs, using fancy jargon to mask their incompetence.
Which logically led to the radical redefinition of the ulema. We saw the text strip the prestigious title of scholar away from the theologians debating unprovable history and hand it directly to the scientists, the geologists, and biologists who actually study the diverse empirical realities of the Earth and who experience true awe through understanding deep time and physical complexity.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate societal stress test, taskir itainat. The stark realization that mastering physical laws is not some optional academic pursuit. It is a brutal requirement for civilizational survival.
Absolutely.
But that physical mastery must be inextricably paired with unyielding ethical laws to avoid the self-destruction of imperialism and war. The true momin, the architect of peace, is the master of both physics and ethics.
So connecting this massive macro-historical framework back down to you, the listener, it forces a very uncomfortable self-audit. In your own life, in your own career, in how you engage with your community, Are you operating on the passive logic of Sabab?
Are you just going through the motions?
Right. Are you clicking agree on the corporate terms and conditions, expecting some magical reward or promotion, without doing the actual hard work of understanding the underlying system? Are you acting like the keyboard warrior, claiming moral superiority while producing zero physical utility for the people around you?
That is a tough question to ask yourself.
Or are you engaging with the objective physical reality of your situation? Are you doing the hard empirical work? Are you observing the signs, understanding the physics of your own life and industry, and demanding a permanent ethical standard for your own actions?
That is the dividing line between building something that lasts and building a delusion. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We talked at the very beginning about that bridge collapsing due to a structural flaw.
All right, the microscopic fracture.
We have seen how this lecture aggressively argues that both physical laws and ethical laws are strictly required for a civilization to stand. So think about this. If a society's inner ethical laws become entirely disconnected from the physical laws of the universe, which one of those laws will shatter first?
Because as the text makes abundantly, terrifyingly clear,
Biology and thermodynamics never, ever compromise. The X-ray does not lie, the atmospheric pressure does not care about your vocabulary, and the structural stress test does not care about your good intentions. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints, keep testing the structures around you, and we will see you next time.